Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
It's funny how the sharpest insults always come dressed in sugar, wrapped in politeness, delivered in a soft tone that almost makes you question whether you heard them right in the first place. But there was nothing ambiguous about Aunt Carol's voice when she turned her head slightly toward me, dabbed at her mouth with a cloth napkin like she was royalty at a gala, and said it. "You're almost 30, no husband, no kids, what a waste." The words hung in the air, hovering over the roast chicken and buttered rolls like smoke after a house fire. It wasn't even the first time she'd said something like that. God knows she'd thrown her barbed little comments at me for years, but something about the way she said it this time, so casually, so confidently, like it was a universally accepted truth, made my blood run a little colder than usual. I looked up from my plate, met her eyes, and smiled. Not a fake, forced smile either, but the kind that comes right before you flip the damn table and walk out. Except I didn't need to flip anything, because I had something better. "Actually," I said, my voice calm and steady as I reached for my glass of water, "I just bought this house you're sitting in." Her wine glass slipped from her hand before she even processed the sentence. It didn't shatter, it just hit the edge of her plate with a loud, awkward clink, tipping slightly and splashing a few red droplets across her white blouse. For once, she didn't have anything to say. She just stared at me, blinking like she'd been slapped with an open palm in front of a crowd. My mother, Elaine, froze mid-chew, her eyes snapping toward me like she'd just realized she didn't actually know her own daughter. The silence at that table was the kind you could slice into thick slabs with a steak knife and serve cold. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it sit, thick and heavy, let it wrap itself around Carol's perfect little world like a rope tightening around her throat. She blinked again, adjusted her posture, opened her mouth to say something, then closed it without a word. Across the table, Uncle Mike muttered something about the mashed potatoes being cold, trying to distract from the moment, but no one was listening. All eyes were on me. I took another sip of water and smiled wider. You ever have one of those moments where everything flips on its head in 5 seconds flat? Where years of snide comments, judgmental glances, and condescending questions finally hit a wall, and that wall is you, finally standing tall and saying, "Not today. I want to ask you something, and I mean it, really think about it." Have you ever had a family member reduce your whole life to whether or not you've married or had children? Like your worth could be summed up in a bridal registry and a diaper bag? And what did you say back, or what should you have said if you'd had the guts? Because I promise you, I've had 1,000 imaginary conversations in my head before this dinner, but nothing, and I mean nothing, was more satisfying than watching Aunt Carol's ego deflate like a balloon with a slow leak. Let me tell you how this dinner even happened, because it wasn't supposed to be anything special. It was meant to be just another family catch-up, one of those routine guilt dinners where my mother insists I show my face, and play nice, because Carol means well. Which is the most delusional lie women have been telling each other for decades just to keep the peace. I hadn't seen Carol in almost a year, and I would have been perfectly fine keeping that streak going, but my mother pushed and pushed until I caved. "Just one dinner," she said. "Just one evening." I agreed, but only because I had a plan. This house, the one we were sitting in, the one with the familiar floral wallpaper, the creaky kitchen door, the heavy wooden dining table that had hosted decades of family meals, wasn't just any house. It was the house my grandparents lived in before they passed, the house Carol had always claimed as her inheritance, the house she assumed would fall into her lap when the old money dried up. But it didn't. Life has a funny way of flipping scripts. After a quiet foreclosure process and a quick private sale, this house ended up on the market under a discreet listing. And I bought it. With my money. My name on the paperwork. My keys in the lock. Carol had no idea. That was always the plan, to say nothing, to let them sit in their assumptions, to let her toss her usual passive-aggressive grenades across the table while pretending I hadn't built my own damn life without her approval. And when she finally dropped her signature insult, the one she'd probably been rehearsing since she walked through the door, I dropped the truth. Calm. Precise. Surgical. Her reaction didn't disappoint. But trust me, this wasn't just about the house. This wasn't just about putting her in her place, although I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel damn good. This was about something bigger, something that had been boiling under the surface for years. Because when people treat your life like a checklist and your identity like a failure for not matching their blueprint, eventually you either break down or you break free. And that night, I chose to break free not with a tantrum, not with tears, but with facts. With ownership. With a deed in my purse and fire in my chest. And the best part? I hadn't even shown her the paperwork yet. That moment was still coming. That moment would be the final twist of the knife, and I hadn't even taken it out of the sheath yet. I've always known that Aunt Carol preferred pretty stories over messy truths, appearances over substance, and well-behaved daughters who followed her mold over anyone who dared to step outside the frame. Even when I was a kid, I could feel it, like a thick perfume in the air every time we visited her house. Everything had to look just right. Every dish perfectly plated. Every conversation carefully controlled. Every child expected to smile on cue and never, ever speak out of line. I remember sitting on the stiff couch in her overly coordinated living room, swinging my legs while her daughters, my cousins Sarah and Emily, rehearsed piano pieces or recited Bible verses like little trained pageant contestants. And I also remember the way Carol's eyes scanned me with faint disapproval, like I'd already failed some silent test before I'd even opened my mouth. Even back then, I wasn't like them. I didn't care for ruffles or bows or the matching headbands Carol insisted made her girls look polished. I liked dirt under my nails, messy hair, stories about monsters and women who fought wars instead of sewing doilies. And Carol didn't hide how she felt about that. She'd press her lips together, tilt her head in that judgmental way of hers, and say things like, "Cassie's always had such a vivid imagination, hasn't she?" Which was code for, "Cassie's weird and we all know it." No one ever said it outright, but I didn't need them to. It was in the way she complimented Sarah's ballet trophies while ignoring my science fair ribbons, or how she gushed about Emily's school dance photos and barely glanced at the art exhibit I worked months on. Even as a child, I knew I was the odd shape that didn't fit her frame. That bias didn't disappear when we grew up, it just evolved. Carol's obsession with image aged like bad wine, getting sharper and more bitter with every year. Now instead of piano recitals and school pageants, it was weddings and babies, holiday photo shoots and gender reveal parties, social media posts curated with surgical precision to show a life that looked like it had been pulled straight from a lifestyle magazine. Sarah had married a chiropractor, popped out 2 blonde, well-dressed children, and opened a little online shop selling embroidered tea towels. Emily followed closely behind, marrying a local contractor and getting pregnant before their 2nd anniversary. Carol beamed like a politician every time she talked about them, which was constantly, as if their life choices were her own personal accomplishments. And then there was me, Cassie, the strange one who didn't follow the script. The one who focused on her career instead of planning a wedding. The one who didn't plaster her life on Facebook, didn't chase white picket fences or joint bank accounts or custom nursery murals. I'd worked my ass off for every dollar I earned, climbed my way up in a competitive industry without family favors, and bought my first property before I turned 30. But somehow none of that counted, not in Carol's world. Promotions, salary raises, financial independence, those weren't real milestones. They didn't come with a diamond ring or a baby bump, so in her eyes, they didn't matter. Every time my mother mentioned something I'd accomplished, if she even mentioned it at all, Carol would respond with a polite smile and immediately pivot back to Sarah's Pinterest-perfect baby shower or Emily's new kitchen backsplash. And my mother, Elaine, bless her tired, anxious heart, never once stepped in to push back. She just sat there, smiling nervously, hands folded in her lap, acting like she didn't notice how her sister turned every conversation into a competition Cassie wasn't allowed to win. I think some part of her believed staying neutral was safer, that keeping the peace mattered more than defending her daughter's dignity. But peace built on silence is just another kind of betrayal, and over time, that silence started to feel heavier than Carol's words. Every time she let Carol talk over me, compare me, dismiss me, it felt like a quiet confirmation that I really was less. That I wasn't the daughter she'd wanted. That maybe Carol was right after all. So when Carol started in again during that dinner, casually dropping another round of comparisons like she was reading from a prepared speech, I felt that old, familiar ache rise in my throat. She was talking about Sarah's newborn this time, her voice dripping with theatrical awe. She's already back to her pre-baby weight, can you believe it? And her nursery is just darling, all sage green and ivory with little woodland creatures. Honestly, Cassie, you really should think about settling down soon. These years just slip through your fingers, and you don't want to wake up one day with nothing to show for it. Nothing to show for it. I could have laughed if I hadn't been so used to it by now. I looked at my mother then, wondering, hoping that maybe she'd say something, anything, to cut through the noise. But she just gave me that faint, anxious smile and looked down at her plate like the mashed potatoes were suddenly the most fascinating thing in the world. And in that moment, I realized something I'd probably known for a long time, but never fully admitted to myself: they don't even see me. Not really. Not for who I am. They only see what I'm not. Not married. Not a mother. Not fitting the mold. And in their eyes, anything outside that mold is just a failure dressed in denial. But they were about to learn that not every legacy is built on diapers and wedding bands. Some of us build our names on something a lot more solid, and this house, the very one they were dining in, was just the beginning. There's a particular kind of silence you never forget, not the kind that follows a loud argument or hangs in a quiet church, but the silence that fills an empty house when you first step inside and realize everything about it is yours now, for better or worse. I still remember the way the air smelled when I walked through the front door the day I picked up the keys, a mix of old wood, lingering dust, and memories that hadn't yet been exorcised from the walls. This house wasn't just property, it wasn't just real estate, and it sure as hell wasn't just a clever move on my part. It was something far more intimate, something tangled up in history and pain, and the kind of legacy nobody ever talks about until it's already eaten you from the inside out. This house was my grandparents' house, the place where we all used to gather for holidays, where the carpet still held the shadows of old furniture, where the kitchen windows still faced the exact patch of backyard where I learned how to ride a bike. I remembered the clatter of my grandfather's typewriter from the back office, the scent of my grandmother's vanilla hand lotion, the faint squeak of the screen door in summer. It wasn't just a building. It was a goddamn museum of ghosts. But I didn't buy it for nostalgia. I bought it to reclaim something that had always been quietly stolen from me, not a piece of property, but a sense of control. It all started with a phone call, a quiet one, casual enough that it didn't even register at first. A friend of mine from the city who worked in a law office mentioned offhand that an old property was about to hit a quiet private sale, no open listings, just whispers in the right circles. When she said the address, my heart stopped for a beat. I hadn't even known it had left the family. Turns out Carol had tried to purchase it when my grandfather's estate was settled, but her finances were complicated. She'd over-leveraged her own home a few years back on some failed renovation and resale project that didn't quite pan out. Quiet bankruptcy threats, missed payments, and a heavily mortgaged house she barely held onto by the skin of her teeth, all of it hushed up so the neighbors wouldn't start talking. Classic Carol, obsessed with the image of stability while privately hemorrhaging behind closed doors. The house had slipped through her fingers, and she didn't have the credit or liquid assets to make a strong enough bid. I did. And I made mine anonymously, through a third-party real estate agent who, coincidentally, used to work with Carol's husband back when his construction business was thriving. The irony was so thick it almost tasted sweet. I never told anyone, not at first. I wanted them to walk into the house assuming the past still belonged to them, to see the walls and smell the old wood polish and think everything was still in its rightful place. That was the whole point. Because people like Carol don't learn from words, they only learn from impact. And what better way to deliver impact than to let her sit smugly in a house she thought was hers by divine right, only to realize too late she was sitting in someone else's kingdom. Of course, the house came with its own baggage: chipped paint, creaky stairs, a plumbing issue in the downstairs bathroom that made me want to scream, but none of that mattered to me. What mattered was the symbolism. What mattered was that for once, I wasn't reacting to their narrative. I was writing my own. Every room I repainted, every box I unpacked, every light fixture I replaced was another quiet declaration that I was no longer the disappointing niece in the corner. I was the owner now, the matriarch of this house. The story had shifted, and I was no longer the punchline, I was the plot twist. And still, that wasn't the whole story. Because the truth is, even though I told myself this was about reclaiming space and settling old scores, there was something deeper driving me, something darker. I wasn't just buying a house. I was burning down a bloodline I never asked to carry. I was tearing up the blueprint that had been handed to me since childhood, the one that said success was a husband, a mortgage with a man's name on it, and a cradle in the corner of the master bedroom. I didn't want to fit into that life. I wanted to demolish it, right down to the foundation, and rebuild something that didn't require me to disappear in order to belong. And yet, even as I sat at that dinner table, watching Carol pretend she still held court in this house, I kept one final ace hidden in my purse, one more document, one more carefully timed reveal, one last twist in a game she never even realized she was losing. Because when you've spent your whole life being underestimated, being overlooked, being reduced to a single sentence, almost 30, no husband, no kids, there's a particular satisfaction in holding the key to their unraveling and deciding exactly when to turn it. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that I had more than a deed in my name and a mortgage in my bank statements. I had a letter. A very specific, very old letter, one I found buried in a box during renovations, sealed in an envelope addressed to my grandfather's lawyer, tucked beneath loose floorboards in the office. A letter that, if read out loud, would split the last illusions of Carol's entitlement right down the middle. But I wasn't ready to show it. Not yet. Let them sit in their pride a little longer. Let them feel safe. Because revenge, when served slowly and layered in silence, always tastes better when no one knows the main course has already been cooked. There's a particular flavor of venom that only exists in family gatherings, and Aunt Carol had been sipping it for years, long before she ever turned it toward me. By the time dessert was being passed around, she had managed to recover just enough composure to pretend my earlier announcement hadn't cracked her confidence like an eggshell, and instead of backing off like a sane person might, she doubled down. That's what people like her do when they feel control slipping. They claw harder, louder, sharper, reaching for anything they can weaponize, even if it's just some half-forgotten story from a decade ago that no one asked to relive. And right on cue, she started in with that syrupy tone that always signaled a fresh attack masked as nostalgia. Remember when Cassie used to wear those Godoffel purple cargo pants in high school? She said, laughing too loudly as if that memory was worthy of a roast. You were such a little oddball. Always with a book in your hand and no sense of fashion. We used to joke you'd end up writing poetry in a basement somewhere. She glanced around the table, fishing for chuckles from anyone willing to validate her performance. Uncle Mike gave a weak laugh, more out of habit than amusement, and even my mother forced a smile, though her fingers were curled too tightly around her fork for it to be genuine. I just nodded slowly, keeping my voice light. Yeah, I remember. And you used to have that perm that made you look like an electrocuted poodle, but we all go through phases, right? The table stilled for a second. Melanie, standing by the kitchen archway with a bottle of red wine in one hand, choked on a quiet laugh. Carol raised her eyebrows and offered a tight smile, clearly not expecting pushback delivered so casually. But she wasn't finished. Her need to regain the upper hand was too strong, her ego too bruised to let me walk away from the evening looking like the one who had everything under control. So she tried again, digging deeper this time, peeling open every petty little detail she could remember from my teenage years like they were scandalous secrets worth exposing. She recounted my high school breakup with David Thompson, the one who cheated on me with a girl from the cheer squad, as though it were a tragic tale of my failure to hold a man. She even brought up my short-lived attempt at community theater, laughing about the time I forgot a line during a local production and said, "Oh hell," in front of a room full of PDA parents. I smiled through all of it, letting her talk, letting her pile one petty anecdote on top of the next, because I knew what was coming. I wanted her to keep going, to build herself a nice little tower of superiority so I could knock it over with one swift blow. The thing about people like Carol is they don't realize they're digging their own graves. They think they're building pedestals. And I've found it's far more satisfying to let them climb all the way to the top before pulling the foundation out from underneath them. Elaine, meanwhile, was looking more uncomfortable by the second. I could see it in the way her hand kept brushing non-existent crumbs off the tablecloth, in the way her eyes darted between Carol and me like she wanted to say something but didn't know which side to choose. Or maybe she did know, but she'd spent so many years staying quiet that she'd forgotten how to speak up when it actually mattered. That's when my phone buzzed gently in my lap. I glanced down to see a message from Melanie. "You sure you don't want me to spill the tea now? I'm 5 seconds away from detonating that kitchen." I smirked and typed back, "Give it a few more minutes. Let her stew." Because I could feel it, the tension in the room had changed. It was heavier now, tighter. Even the clink of silverware against plates had gone hollow, like everyone was waiting for something they couldn't quite name. The power dynamic had shifted and everyone knew it, even if Carol refused to acknowledge it. And then, like she couldn't resist one final jab, Carol leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine with one hand and said, "Well, at least when your mother and I are gone, the family legacy will still live on through Sarah and Emily. It's comforting to know the house will stay in our line, not just drift into some stranger's hands." The words landed like a slap across the table, not because they were surprising, but because of how casually she said them, like it was a foregone conclusion that the house we were sitting in, my house, the one she assumed belonged to some distant idea of family lineage, would inevitably belong to one of her daughters. Not because they earned it, not because they deserved it, but simply because they fit the mold. And that was my moment. I reached into my purse, slow and deliberate, pulled out the second envelope, the one I'd kept sealed until now, and placed it gently in the center of the table without saying a word. Carol's eyes locked on it like it was a ticking bomb, and in a way, it was. I didn't touch it again. I didn't need to. It sat there quietly, humming with potential, with everything she didn't know was coming. Because some houses carry more than walls and windows. Some carry truth. And this one was about to echo with it. There's a certain weight in silence that isn't sadness, isn't tension, but something colder, the kind of silence that settles just before a storm tears open the sky. That was the sound at the table when I slid the envelope across the smooth wood, placing it gently between the wine glasses and half-finished dessert plates like it was just another part of the meal. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The envelope spoke for itself. Thick, ivory-toned, no markings except for the crisp fold and the weight of what was inside, a truth so sharp, so heavy, that even the faint rustle of paper sounded like thunder. Carol's eyes locked on it like she already knew what was coming, though I could tell she was clinging to hope, the desperate kind that only blooms in the minds of people who've built their entire worth on illusions. She reached for it slowly, like it might bite her, like some part of her was hoping it wasn't what she feared. But when her fingers slipped beneath the flap and pulled the document free, her entire posture changed. It was subtle, but it was there, the slight hunch of her shoulders, the twitch at the corner of her mouth, the way her hand paused mid-page as her eyes scanned line after line. Everyone else at the table leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse, trying to understand what had just entered the room like a ghost from a locked attic. The deed wasn't just proof of ownership, it was a carefully folded confession. My name, spelled in bold letters, inked beneath a transaction date that made it unmistakably clear I hadn't just recently bought the house. I'd owned it for months. The place she had walked into with her chin high and her voice full of inherited pride had never been hers, not even in spirit. And now, laid bare in front of everyone, was the truth, undeniable, documented, and weaponized with the precision of someone who'd waited years for this exact moment. Carol didn't speak right away. She just sat there, staring at the paper like it was in another language, like the letters had betrayed her by forming my name instead of hers. I watched her throat move as she swallowed hard, then lifted her head slightly, voice brittle but still laced with that desperate control she'd clung to since the first bite of dinner. "You bought it," she said, but it wasn't a question. It was a plea masquerading as disbelief. I nodded, calm and unbothered, folding my napkin slowly and placing it beside my plate. "Yes," I said. "I bought it months ago. Quiet sale. Private listing. Cash offer. No contingencies." Elaine looked like she'd been slapped. Her hand went to her chest instinctively, eyes darting between Carol and me like she was watching a car crash in slow motion. You didn't say anything," she said softly, not accusing but stunned, like she couldn't decide whether to be impressed or betrayed. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I looked at her gently, but my voice didn't waver. Because it wouldn't have meant the same if I'd said it then. It needed to be seen. Across the table, Melanie leaned against the kitchen doorway, sipping her wine with a smirk on her face that was so subtle it almost passed as polite. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. I'd told her everything weeks ago, right down to the letterhead and the fine print. She'd even helped me dig into the sale records, just to be sure there was no loophole Carol could try to exploit. Melanie had a gift for finding cracks in things: marriages, businesses, bank statements. And it was her who had discovered the rest of the story, the one that made this reveal so much more than just a property transaction. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together as I let my gaze settle on Carol. "Funny thing is," I continued, "you would have had first dibs. You would have been able to make an offer if you hadn't defaulted on that business loan 2 years ago. You remember that one, the little renovation company you sunk all that money into? Used your house as collateral, nearly lost it when the contractor skipped town. Had to go crawling to the bank to beg them not to make it public. Thought nobody knew." Her face drained of color so fast it was almost comical. She looked at Uncle Mike, who was blinking like a man who had just realized he'd walked into a conversation 10 minutes too late. "That's not true," she said, but it lacked conviction, and everyone at the table knew it. Lies only work when your voice doesn't tremble. "It's public record," Melanie finally chimed in, voice smooth and factual. "You just have to know where to look. I'd be happy to send you the links if you want to refresh your memory." Carol's hand dropped to her lap, the deed still resting in front of her like a loaded gun. I could see her scrambling, mentally clawing through excuses, searching for some way to regain control of the narrative, but there was none. Not this time. She had walked into this house thinking she owned the space with her presence, not realizing the space itself had already chosen its new queen. And then, like clockwork, Uncle Mike tried to smooth things over with a clumsy attempt at optimism. "Well," he said, chuckling nervously, "at least it's still in the family, right?" He looked around for validation, but no one responded. Even he could feel it. This wasn't a win for them. This was a funeral for a fantasy. Elaine was still quiet, her eyes now cast downward, her fingers tapping the edge of her plate like she was trying to keep herself anchored. I could see something shifting behind her eyes, a flicker of something that looked like regret, or maybe realization, but she said nothing. And Carol just stared at me. Her face had cracked, not completely shattered, but fractured enough to show what was underneath: fear, bitterness, confusion. Not because she'd lost a house, but because she'd lost the illusion that she could control the story. That she could keep holding the pen while someone else lived the life. And the best part? I still hadn't opened the letter. People think revenge is loud, all screaming and shattering glass and dramatic exits where the door slams so hard it echoes for days. But what they never tell you is that the most satisfying kind of revenge is quiet, almost gentle. Like a soft closing of a book that everyone thought you'd never get to finish. It's not about getting even, not really. It's about reclaiming something that was taken from you long before you knew how to fight for it. Something that wasn't a house or a name or even a seat at the table. It was your story, your voice. Your goddamn right to define your own life without needing to justify it to anyone. After the last guest had left and the dishes were stacked in the sink and the air had finally begun to settle back into something that felt breathable again, I found Melanie in the kitchen, barefoot, leaning against the counter with a glass of wine still in her hand and an expression that could only be described as deeply impressed. She looked at me like she was still trying to wrap her head around the way the evening had unfolded, the way I'd played every move like a seasoned chess master while Carol scrambled just to keep her pieces on the board. "You really planned every second of that, didn't you?" she asked, not accusingly but with a kind of admiration that made me feel taller in my own skin. I nodded slowly, took the glass from her hand, and sipped without answering right away. The truth was, I had planned it not with vengeance in mind, not even with the goal of making anyone squirm. I did it because I needed to see, with my own eyes, that I was no longer standing on the outside of a life I had spent years trying to get into. I needed to stop trying to prove myself to people who had no intention of seeing me clearly in the first place. I needed to stop chasing a seat at a table that had always treated me like the unwanted extra chair. It wasn't about revenge, I finally said, my voice low and steady. It wasn't even about respect, not really. It was about reclaiming my narrative. I got tired of letting other people write my story for me. Melanie nodded, eyes softening, the smirk fading just enough to show the seriousness underneath. "You flipped the whole damn board," she said. "Didn't try to win their game, just made your own rules." I thought about that for a long moment. That was exactly it. I'd spent so much of my life trying to play a game that was never designed for someone like me to win, the good daughter competition, the perfect niece performance, the make yourself small to keep the peace routine that gets passed down like a cursed heirloom in so many families. But somewhere along the way, I stopped caring about winning their approval and started caring about building something real, something mine. And that house, that deed, that dinner table, they weren't just trophies or symbols of victory. They were proof that I could live outside their expectations and still stand tall. Later that night, after Melanie had gone home and the house had gone still and quiet again, I walked back into the dining room, letting my fingers trail lightly along the edge of the table, the same table where my grandfather used to sit during Sunday lunches, his hand resting right on the corner where I stood now. I remembered the way he used to wink at me when Carol got too loud, the way he'd sneak me extra slices of pie when my mother wasn't looking. He was one of the few people in the family who never tried to mold me into something I wasn't. He just saw me, strange, messy, bookish little me, and loved me anyway. I sat down in his old chair, not for the symbolism, not for the poetry of it, but because it felt right. It felt like grounding myself in the roots I chose, not the ones others tried to force on me. And then, without really thinking about it, I reached into the side drawer of the old buffet cabinet and pulled out a photo I'd tucked away weeks earlier, a black and white snapshot from Carol's wedding, slightly curled at the edges, the corners yellowing from time. There she was in her satin dress, beaming like royalty, and just behind her, half-shadowed and barely in frame, was my mother, eyes downcast, shoulders drawn, wiping a tear that might have been joy or might have been something else entirely. I stared at that photo for a long time, longer than I meant to, and wondered if my mother ever wanted a different story too. If she ever felt like the role she was handed, the quiet sister, the agreeable wife, the one who kept her head down and let others take the spotlight, had been a life she settled into rather than one she chose. I didn't know for sure. Maybe I'd never know. But I couldn't carry her silence anymore. I couldn't inherit her guilt or her regret or her invisible chains. I folded the photo back into the drawer, stood up slowly, and turned off the dining room light, letting the shadows settle over the walls like an old blanket. No speeches. No grand endings. Just stillness and a house that was finally, fully, mine. Funny thing about legacy, it's not what you inherit. It's what you refuse to carry forward.